Hello, Miss Shaden's class. Today we are going to finish up The Witches. This chapter is called The Heart of a Mouse. It was lovely to be back in Norway once again in my grandmother's fine old house. But now that I was so small, everything looked different. It took me quite a while to find my way around. Mine was a world of carpets and table legs and chair legs and the little crannies behind large pieces of furniture. A closed door could not be opened, and nothing could be reached that was on the table. But after a few days, my grandmother began to invent gadgets for me in order to make my life a bit easier. She got a carpenter to put together a number of slim, tall step ladders, and she placed one of these against each table in the house so that I could climb up whenever I wanted to. She herself invented a wonderful door-opening device made out of wires and springs and pulleys, with heavy weights dangling on cords, and soon every door in the house had a door opener on it. All I had to do was press my front paws onto the tiny wooden platforms, and hey, presto, a spring would stretch, a weight would drop, and the door would swing open. Next, she rigged up an equally ingenious system whereby I could switch on the light whenever I entered a room at night. I cannot explain how it worked because I know nothing about electricity, but there was a little button let into the floor near the door in every room in the house. When I pressed the button gently with one paw, the light would come on. When I pressed it a second time, the light would go off again. My grandmother made me a tiny toothbrush using a matchstick for a handle, and into this she stuck little bits of bristle that she had snipped off one of her hairbrushes. "You must not get holes in your teeth," she said. "I can't take a mouse to the dentist. He'd think I was crazy." "It's funny," I said, "but ever since I became a mouse, I've hated the taste of sweets and chocolate, so I don't think I'll get any holes." "You're still going to brush your teeth after every meal," my grandmother said. And I did. For a bathtub, she gave me a silver sugar basin, and I bathed in it every night before going to bed. She allowed no one else in the house, not even a servant or a cook. We kept entirely to ourselves, and we were very happy in each other's company. One evening, as I lay on my grandmother's lap in front of the fire, she said to me, "I wonder what happened to that little Bruno. I wouldn't be surprised if his father gave him to the hall porter to drown in the fire bucket." I answered, "I'm afraid you may be right," my grandmother said. "The poor little thing." We were silent for a few minutes, my grandmother puffing away at her black cigar while I dozed comfortably in the warmth. "Can I ask you something, Grandmama?" I said. "Ask me anything you'd like, my darling." "How long does a mouse live?" "Ah," she said, "I've been waiting for you to ask me that." There was silence. She sat there smoking away and gazing at the fire. "Well," I said, "how long do we live, us mice?" "I've been reading about mice," she said. "I have been trying to find out everything I can about them." "Then, go on, Grandmama. Why don't you tell me?" "If you really want to know," she said, "I'm afraid that a mouse doesn't live for a very long time." "How long?" I asked. "Well, an ordinary mouse only lives about 3 years," she said, "but you are no ordinary mouse. You are a mouse person, and that is a very different matter." "How different?" I asked. "How long does a mouse person live, Grandmama?" "Longer," she said, "much longer. A mouse person will almost certainly live for 3 times as long as an ordinary mouse," my grandmother said. "About 9 years. "Good," I cried. "That's great. That's the best news I've ever had." "Why do you say that?" she asked, surprised. "Because I would never want to live longer than you," I said. "I couldn't stand being looked after by anybody else." There was a short silence. She had a way of fondling me behind the ears with the tip of one finger. It felt lovely. "How old are you, Grandmama?" I asked. "I'm 86, she said. "Will you live another 8 or 9 years?" I might, she said, with a bit of luck. You've got to, I said, because by then I'll be a very old mouse and you'll be a very old grandmother, and soon after that we'll both die together. That would be perfect, she said. I had a little doze right after that. I shut my eyes and thought of nothing and felt at peace with the world. Would you like me to tell you something about yourself that's very interesting? My grandmother said. Yes, please, Grandmama, I said without opening my eyes. I couldn't believe it at first, but apparently it's quite true, she said. What is it? I asked. The heart of a mouse, she said. And that means your heart is beating at the rate of 500 times a minute. Isn't that amazing? That's not possible, I said, opening my eyes wide. It's as true as I am sitting here, she said. It's a sort of miracle that's nearly 9 beats every second, I cried, working it out in my head. Correct, she said. Your heart is going so fast, it's impossible to hear the separate beats. All one hears is a soft humming sound. She was wearing a lace dress, and the lace kept tickling my nose. I had to rest my head on my front paws. Have you ever heard my heart humming away, Grandmama? I asked. Often, she said. I hear it when you are lying very close to me on the pillow at night. The two of us remained silent in front of the fire for a long time after that, thinking about these wonderful things. My darling, she said at last. Are you sure you don't mind being a mouse for the rest of your life? I don't mind at all, I said. It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like, as long as somebody loves you. Our next chapter is called It's Off to Work We Go. For supper that evening, my grandmother had a plain omelet and a slice of bread. I had a piece of brown Norwegian goat's milk cheese known as yoghurt, which I had loved even when I was a boy. We ate in front of the fire, my grandmother in her armchair and me on the table with my cheese on a small plate. Grandmama, I said, now that we have done away with the Grand High Witch, will all the other witches in the world gradually disappear? I'm quite sure they won't, she said. I stopped chewing and stared at her. But they must, I cried. Surely they must. I'm afraid not, she said. But if she's not there any longer, how are they going to get all their money they need? And who's going to give them orders and jazz them up at the annual meetings and invent their magic formulas for them? When a queen bee dies, there is always another queen in the hive ready to take her place. My grandmother said, it's the same with witches. In the great headquarters where the Grand High Witch lives, there is always another Grand High Witch waiting in the wings to take over should anything happen. Oh no, I cried. That means everything we did was all for nothing. I have become a mouse for nothing at all. We saved the children of England, she said. I don't call that nothing. I know, I cried. But that's not nearly good enough. I felt sure that all the witches of the world would slowly fade away after we got rid of their leader. Now you tell me that everything is going to go on just the same as before. Not exactly as before, my grandmother said. For instance, there are no longer any witches in England. That's quite a triumph, isn't it? But what about the rest of the world, I cried. What about America and France and Holland and Germany? And what about Norway? You must not think I have been sitting back and doing nothing these last few days, she said. I have been giving a great deal of thought and time to that particular problem. I was looking up at her face when she said this, and all at once I noticed a little secret smile was beginning to spread slowly around her eyes and the corners of her mouth. Why are you smiling, Grandmama? I asked her. I have some rather interesting news for you, she said. What news? Shall I tell it to you right from the beginning? Yes, please, I said. I like good news. She had finished her omelet, and I had enough of my cheese. She wiped her lips with a napkin and said, as soon as we arrived back in Norway, I picked up the telephone and made a call to England. Who in England, Grandmama? To the chief of police in Bournemouth, my darling. I told him I was the chief of police for the whole of Norway, and that I was interested in the particular happenings that had taken place recently in the Hotel Magnificent. Now hang on a second, Grandmama, I said. There's no way an English policeman is going to believe that you are the head of the Norwegian police. I'm very good at imitating a man's voice, she said. Of course, he believed me. The policeman in Bournemouth was honored to get a call from the chief of police for the whole of Norway. So what did you ask him? I asked him for the name and address of the lady who had been living in room 454 in the Hotel Magnificent, the one who disappeared. You mean the Grand High Witch, I cried. Yes, my darling. And did he give it to you? Naturally, he gave it to me. One policeman will always help another policeman. By golly, you've got a nerve, Grandmama. I wanted her address, my grandmother said. But did he know her address? He did indeed. They found her passport in her room, and her address was in it. It was also in the hotel register. Everyone that stays in a hotel has to put their name and address in the book. But surely the Grand High Witch wouldn't have put her real name and address in the hotel register, I said. Why ever not? My grandmother said. Nobody in the world has the faintest idea who she was except for the other witches. Wherever she went, people simply knew her as a nice lady. You, my darling, and you alone are the only non-witch to ever see her with her mask off. Even in her home district, in the village where she lived, people knew her as a kindly and very wealthy baroness who gave large sums of money to charity. I have checked up on that, and I was getting excited now. And that address you got, Grandmama, that must have been the secret. And the address that you got, Grandmama, that must have been the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. It still is, my grandmother said. And that will be where the new Grand High Witch is certain to be living at this very moment, with her retinue of special assistant witches. Important rulers are always surrounded by large retinues of assistants. Where's her headquarters, Grandmama? I cried. Tell me quickly where it is. It is a castle, my grandmother said. And the fascinating thing is that in that castle will be all the names and addresses of all the witches in the world. How else could a Grand High Witch run her business? How else could she summon the witches from various countries to their annual meetings? Where is the castle, Grandmama? I cried impatiently. Which country? Tell me quick. Guess, she said. Norway, I cried. Right, first time, she answered. High up in the mountains above a small village. This was thrilling news. I did a little dance of excitement on the tabletop. My grandmother was getting pretty worked up herself, and now she heaved herself out of her chair and began pacing up and down the room, thumping the carpet with her stick. So, we have work to do, you and I, she cried out. We have a great task ahead of us. Thank heavens you're a mouse. A mouse can go anywhere, and all I'll have to do is put you down somewhere near the Grand High Witch's castle, and you will very easily be able to get inside and creep around, looking and listening to your heart's content. I will, I answered. No one will ever see me. Moving about in a big castle will be child's play compared with going into a crowded kitchen full of cooks and waiters. You could spend days in there if necessary. My grandmother cried in her excitement. She was waving her stick all over the place, and suddenly she knocked over a tall and very beautiful vase that went crashing on the floor and smashed into a million pieces. Forget it, she said. It's only Ming. You could spend weeks in that castle if you wanted to, and they'd never know you were there. I, myself, would get a room in the village and could sneak out of the castle and have supper with me every night and tell me what's going on. I could, I cried. And inside the castle, I could go snooping around simply everywhere. But your main job, of course, my grandmother said, would to be to destroy every witch in the place. That really would be the end of the whole organization. Me? Destroy them? She cried. How would I do that? Can't you guess? I said. Tell me. Can't you guess? She said. Tell me, I said. Mouse maker, my grandmother shouted. Formula 86 delayed action mouse maker all over again. You will feed it to everyone in the castle by putting drops of it into their food. Do you remember the recipe? You remember the recipe, don't you? Every bit of it, I answered. You mean we're going to make it ourselves? Why not? She cried. If they can make it, so can we. It's just a question of knowing what goes into it. Who's going to climb up the tall trees and get the Gruntel's eggs? I asked her. I will, she cried. I'll do it myself. There's plenty of life in this old dog yet. I think I'd better do that part of it, Grandmama. You might come a cropper. Those are just details, she cried, waving her stick again. We shall let nothing stand in our way, and what happens after that, I asked her. After the new Grand High Witch and everyone else in the castle has been turned into mice, then the castle will be completely empty, and I shall come in. Then the castle will be completely empty, and I shall come in and join you, and... Wait, I cried. Hold on, Grandmama. I've just had a nasty thought. What nasty thought? She said. When the mouse maker turned me into a mouse, I said, I didn't become just any old ordinary mouse that you can catch with mouse traps. I became a talking, thinking, intelligent mouse person who wouldn't go near a mouse trap. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks. She already knew what was coming next. Therefore, I went on, if the mouse maker had turned the new Grand High Witch and all the other witches in the castle into mice, the whole place would be swarming with very clever, very nasty, very dangerous, talking, thinking mouse witches. They'd all be witches and in mouse clothing, and that, I added, could be very horrible indeed. By golly, you're right, she cried. That never occurred to me. I couldn't possibly take on a castle full of mouse witches, I said. Nor could I, she said. They'd have to be got rid of at once. They'd have to be smashed and bashed and chopped up into little pieces, exactly as they were in the Hotel Magnificent. I'm not doing that, I said. I couldn't anyway. I don't think you could either, Grandmama, and mousetraps wouldn't be the slightest use, by the way. I added, the Grand High Witch who did me in was wrong about mousetraps, wasn't she? Yes, my grandmother said impatiently, but I'm not concerned with that Grand High Witch. She's been chopped up long ago by the hotel chef. It's the new Grand High Witch we've got to deal with now. The one up in the castle and all her assistants. A Grand High Witch is bad enough when she's disguised as a lady, but just think what she could do if she were a mouse. She could go anywhere. I've got it, I shouted, leaping about a foot in the air. I've got the answer. Tell me, my grandmother snapped. The answer is cats, I shouted. Bring on the cats. My grandmother stared at me, then a great grin spread across her face, and she shouted, It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Shove half a dozen cats into the castle, I cried, and they'll kill every mouse in the place in 5 minutes. I don't care how clever you are. or how clever they are. You're a magician, my grandmother shouted, starting to wave her stick about once again. Look out for the vases, Grandmama. To heck with the vases, she shouted. I'm so thrilled. I don't care if I break the lot. Just one thing, I said. You've got to make absolutely sure that I'm well out of the way myself before you put the cats in. That's a promise, she said. What will we do after the cats have killed the mice? I asked her. I'll take all the cats back to the village, and then you and I will have the castle completely to ourselves. And then, I said, then we shall go through the records and get the names and addresses of all the witches in the whole world. And after that, I said, quivering with excitement, after that, my darling, the greatest task of all will begin for you and me. We shall pack our bags and go traveling all over the world. In every country we visit, we shall seek out the houses where the witches are living. We shall find each house one by one, and having found it, you will creep inside, leave your drops of deadly mouse maker in the bread, or the cornflakes, or the rice pudding, or whatever food you see lying about. It will be a triumph, my darling. A colossal, unbeatable triumph. We shall do it entirely by ourselves, just you and me. That will be our work for the rest of our lives. My grandmother picked me up off the table and kissed me on the nose. Oh my goodness me. We're going to be busy these next few weeks and months and years, she cried. I think we are, I said. But what fun and excitement it's going to be. You can say that again, my grandmother cried, giving me another kiss. I can't wait to get started.